This is a ManeHustle Media podcast.
Hey y'all, this is Jhavia Nicole, aka your favorite lesbian, and you're listening to Black Radical Queer Podcast, our stories on our own terms.
Hey y'all, this is a very special ManeHustle Media combined two-part episode of both Militantly Mixed and Black Radical Queer. I am one of your hosts, Sharmane, aka Mixed Girl Mane.
And this is Jhavia Nicole, aka your favorite lesbian. And Sharmane and I are actually bringing to you a collaborative segment called Mind On My Melanin. And we will be talking about how mental health issues impact people of color. And it's actually an idea that we've had for a while and that was really kind of what brought us together. So Sharmane is going to give some info about how we embarked on this, like what, where this came from. And then we'll get right into our first mental health topic.
So Militantly Mixed was kind of inspired by, in title, by a conversation that Jhavia and I had a couple years ago, actually the first time that we had met in person. She and I were involved in this online community, like a shared interest group, and we knew each other for a few years, online only. But when I knew I was moving out here and she had recently moved out here in Los Angeles, I hit her up and let her know I was coming. And so she arranged this sort of like Black Girl Magic night of like fellow woke Black women, and we met up for dinner, and it was this great night. And during the course of the night, Jhavia, her then girlfriend, now wife, and I were having this conversation about sort of my mixedness and sort of being seen, my desire to be seen as this like Black militant person that I identified as. And Jhavia and her wife were really validating of me and my experience. And at some point, someone said something that triggered me going like, yeah, I'm militantly mixed. And in that moment, it just kind of like snapped together. And I had my title. And so for the show that I wanted to do. And so I like got on the phone while we're in our dinner. And I'm like on Twitter and Instagram, like snatching up all those social media handles because I now had the title for the thing that I wanted to do. So if you listen to the Militantly Mixed, you already know the origin of the show and my original partner and everything like that. But if you don't, if you just listen to Black Radical Queer, I started the show intending to do it with a partner. Our schedules were in conflict, so I started to do the show by myself, and I now had this title because of this conversation inspired by Jhavia. So when I'm finally ready to pull the trigger and start this show, I also knew that my overall goal was to create a podcast network for POC created content, and I knew that in addition to Militantly Mixed, I would want to have something about mental health in the Black community on the network. And so I reached out to our shared group of women and, just to let them know like, hey, I'm doing this podcast about mixedness, but I want to do this other one about mental health. I know a lot of us deal with that, and I don't think I'm equipped to handle the show entirely by myself. So is there anybody who maybe want to partner with me? And I put it out to the whole group, but like low key, I was really hoping that Jhavia would be the one that would respond because of all the conversations we had already had previously about mental health and everything. And I knew about her wealth of knowledge, personally and professionally. So she hit me up and she was like, yeah, let's do this. And in the course of us trying to develop Mind On My Melanin, we also got kind of really focused on two separate projects, which was me continuing my Militantly Mixed and Jhavia wanting to do Black Radical Queer. So we kind of dove in on those and said, like, we'll put it on the shelf and revisit Mind On My Melanin when we get a little bit of chance to go. But now we've come to this point where it makes sense to do these sort of special segments, which we'll host on both of our shows. And in this case, it'll be a two-parter. Half of it will release on Black Radical Queer Part 1 and half of it will release on Militantly Mixed Part 2. So you get a chance to be exposed to both channels and hopefully you'll enjoy both shows. But at least for the segments of Mind On My Melanin, you'll have access to these mental health topics that affect our communities as Black people or mixed Black people in my case. And I think, does that sound about accurate, Jhavia?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, I think what it was is with Mind On My Melanin, we were so kind of it was kind of a big task. I mean, there are so many mental health issues that we wanted to tackle, and we were talking about a lot of different things, and we're just like, how do we approach this? Do we need to get a lot of experts to kind of come on and, back us up and do all this stuff? And we, in the midst of that, because a big part of mental health is just your lived experiences, we started talking about militantly mixed and Black radical queer. And because those are the things that are our really kind of these podcast manifestations of who we are. So that's how those things kind of came up. And it's like, okay, well, militantly mixed had been on Sharmane's mind and had been on her plans. And for me, BRQ was an idea. I didn't know how I wanted to go about manifesting it, but I had been getting these signs that it should be a podcast. So as we explored mental health, we started talking about kind of just our individual stories, which are the things that militantly mixed and Black radical queer were birthed from. So that's kind of how we veered off into those directions in terms of getting those out. But we knew that, hey, we'll come back to this collaborative effort once we get a chance to kind of say, well, hey, here's me in terms of militantly mixed, here's me as I am, and kind of you get to get some insight on who Sharmane is, and here's BRQ, here's who I am, very much a Black radical queer woman. So you get to know us, and now it's like, okay, well, let's come together and talk about something that is very much a big part of both of our lives and our identities, which is our mental health. And we do see a need for that to be discussed among people of color. So
I think too, it just shows why you and I are connected at all, because both of the themes of our individual podcasts are very much about radicalness and militancy and improving our people, improving our lives through our people. Someone asked me, one of my interviewees for an upcoming episode of Militant Mix asked, well, why militant and radical? And at first I stopped and I was like, what do you mean radical? And she's like, well, your other podcasts, on your network, why are those your themes? And so I was like, oh yeah, that's why we're friends. Because we both come from these places of like needing to be sort of out there and unapologetically all the things that we are, and that manifests through, I think of Militantly Mixed as a self-portrait, not just in, even though I'm talking to a bunch of other people, every person that I talk to in some way so far has been a reflection or something like that of me. I feel like I see myself and they're seeing themselves through our conversations, even down to my logo being what I feel is like a self-portrait of me, a graphic self-portrait in the Rising Sun and the Black Power Fist and all that kind of stuff. Like it was putting together the things that feel like me. And I absolutely think that is the case for you with Black Radical Queer.
I mean, Black Radical Queer literally has my.
It's like it's just self-identified
my logo
title.
Is my image is like literally me. Right. So it's like my face, and which still trips me out because I made my logo. I have a text logo too, but my image, my logo is my face, and I hesitated so much with using like an image of myself when doing this, because a big part of it was I do want to have these stories of other Black queer people, and it was a big part of. I think it's good that you use the term self-portrait because that was a big part of it. I knew that these stories resonated with me. And so I really wanted to, I just struggled. I was like, okay, should I use my image or should I use something that's a little more neutral or generic? But I'm like, this is me. Like, I am Black, I'm radical, I'm queer. And I really am showing myself, because even as I talk to my guests, the audience get to know more. You get to know more about me. You get to know more about the people who move me, the topics that move me, and these things that resonate with me, because I feel like as these people are sharing themselves with me and sharing themselves with the audience, we are really like, you're getting to see like why it is that I wanted to have these conversations with them and why I wanted them to, come on this platform. So, but the thing with BRQ and with Militantly Mixed, we're talking about our identities, and that is, of course, like the biggest informant on our mental health. So exactly. It's unavoidable, really. So I do feel like
neither of us have hidden from it in both of our things. Like, both of you and I have had these conversations on our podcast and together about being out of the closet, about fill in the blank, all of our stuff. So whether or not you're out as LGBT, whether or not you're out as poly, whether or not you're out. And in my case, I have an episode coming up called "Coming Out as Mixed." Like, you literally do have to come out of the closet all the time, and mental health is a part of that, right? And so while there are areas in which I feel like, and I think you too have said, I don't want to always have to come out as LGBT. It's I don't need that to be everybody's business. But where
right.
I think
talked about that on a few episodes. Like I have a few episodes talking about coming out. My most recent one is about like coming out being hard, and you have to be selective, and so coming out being very difficult, but you do it in different ways, and mental health is not exempt from that.
Yeah. And I feel like in my case, for sure, when I talk about suffering from depression and anxiety, I try to do it as normal or as monotone and flat as possible, because I don't want it to, because I'm trying to reduce that stigma of it not being like, you don't want to talk about it. And especially for those of us that are Black. I mean, I don't know for other races, even though I'm mixed race, I feel it more from my Black side than other sides. We aren't allowed, even within our own culture, to have mental health problems. We either need Jesus,
even though we
or we need a salad, or we need to go for a walk.
Right. I mean, even though we have so many things that we have so many justifiable reasons for having mental health issues.
Right. We have like
so many valid, like we have
trauma in our genetics.
I mean, generational trauma and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we have so many valid reasons. Systemic oppression, hello. Yeah. But there is a stigma, and even outside of that, sometimes there's just a lot of individual and personal shame. And for me, I can't say that I talk about it in a kind of in a monotone, which I do get, because it's like, okay, I want to destigmatize this, and I want it to be seen as normal, like just like if you're talking about, hey, like I broke my leg, or just because it is, a health issue, and it is important to remove that stigma. But I do try to be as transparent as possible, and it was a very deliberate decision I made to kind of share about my mental health issues, because I'm like, I know there's other people out there who can relate to it, and they may not feel comfortable sharing their issues, but hearing someone else so that they don't feel alone. Because I have definitely felt alone before in not necessarily my individual issues, but in the combination of them. Right. And I think it's important to know, like, hey, there's somebody else who's living with all the intersections of these things kind of coming together. And so when I talk about it, I do, sometimes I am emotional, sometimes because it has been such an impactful thing in my life that it is hard for me to kind of like, I still will talk about it matter of factly, and I don't want to talk about it like, oh my God, I'm cursed or anything like that. But at the same time, it is emotional because it has wreaked havoc on my life. And it's just like, when I look at it, it has the magnitude of it. It just blows my mind. So I try to find that balance. Like, I'm going to be transparent and authentic and genuine about like, hey, this is what I'm going through, and this shit sucks. Like, this shit fucking sucks. So just kind of still destigmatizing it, because, hey, I'm not the only one, Right.
And I think both of us have said, so I have a slightly unfair advantage in talking from the both of us perspective, because not only do I sit in on and produce your podcast, but I have my own podcast too. So there's times when you will say something, when I'm just, the person behind the curtain, you'll say something to your guests on your show, and it'll be like, I say that all the time too, and you and I haven't even talked about this stuff yet. Like, it's these weird moments that I have with you as an observer, where you say things and it touches directly into something that I'm dealing with or I'm going through, and something that both of us have said totally individual of each other on our podcast was that we created the podcast that we needed. That we needed to hear, we needed the representation of the things that we are and the things that we're going through. And we weren't finding it, so we created our own. And I feel like that's what this is too. The discussion about our mental health is an extension of that. It's like, we need to, as a culture, destigmatize mental health issues, and more than that, we need to just comfort each other, because we all deal with the trauma as we deal with the trauma of the stereotypes against us tell us we're not allowed to not be strong, and we're not allowed to show emotional weakness or even physical weakness or whatever.
Right.
And you know, you have the angry black woman stigma, you have the independent black woman stigma, you have the can't trust a man black woman stigma. Like, you know, we have all of these fucked up stereotypes that are circulating in our media and our families. I mean, I think in a lot of cases our families are some of the biggest culprits of making us feel like we're not supposed to have.
And they're just perpetuating what's been ingrained into them.
Right. And so you and I both, whether we've talked about it or not talked about it, I definitely see it because I get to sit through and listen to your podcasts and mine, is that you and I are both out here saying no. There's more chains than just the historical slavery chains to break. There are the stereotypical things that are put against us that we need to break. There's the way the world views black women, and to assume that we're not strong if we can admit mental health issues. Like, all of that stuff, we need to break those chains. And that's what we're doing. So when we feel the need to share, and sometimes I say it very kind of like, it's matter of fact, but it's also sort of flippant, because like I'm actively trying to say, like, look, you've interacted with me a number of times and you see that I'm perfectly fine, but I do have this thing that I deal with, and it's a chronic thing in my life, and it's something I've dealt with through childhood, but I can still function. I can still be out here. I can be a manager of this department at this job, or I can be, you know, a podcaster or a filmmaker or a friend. And just because I have this thing doesn't mean that I'm not able to function. And it's also kind of destigmatizing the idea that depression equals sadness. And I try to say all the time, you can be depressed and happy, you can be depressed and sad. And an example of that is the first couple weeks of Militantly Mixed. I was on such a high for finally getting this stuff out that I've been wanting to do. And even though it had morphed into something different than my original plan, it had morphed into something that I thought was even better than my original plan. So I was riding this high, and I was really happy the whole time. And I was even like, you know, people were saying, "Oh my gosh, you've been down so long. It's nice to see you this way." And that stuff started to mess me up again, because it was like, look, I'm still depressed. I'm not done being depressed. I walk around all day long. It is always there. But there are times when I can be happy. It doesn't mean that I'm not thinking about the depression. Now, there are really, really dark times when I am on my couch and watching 30 Rock on repeat because I can't function. Absolutely, that shit happens. And sometimes that happens one day, and the next day I'm happy, and then it happens again, and I'm back on my couch. This is my life. I can maneuver it. I know how I have to deal with it. I know how to have to maneuver it. But I also kind of need people to stop thinking that it just means sadness, because sadness.
Well, I mean, there's a difference. It's kind of like looking at the difference between weather and climate. So you have your weather every day. Your weather can change day by day, you know, but when you look at what happens over the long term, that's the climate. So when people say, well, global warming isn't real because look, there's snow. Like, okay, it can still snow. That's, you know, the weather, but we're looking at long-term patterns of climate. So it's the same thing in terms of sadness and depression. Like, sadness is a natural, normal thing. And even depression is a natural, normal thing. And a lot of people, most people experience some bouts of depression over the course of their lifetime, but that's not the same thing as just being sad, because sadness is not the only characteristic of depression. And there's other ways that it manifests, and some of that varies based on gender, some of that varies based on age, some of that varies based on cultural background. And so it's important to look at all of those elements. And a lot of it just has to do with misinformation or lack of information in regards to what it actually means. People do use depressed as a synonym for sad. So that's why there's this cultural kind of misconception about, oh, if someone's depressed, oh, you're just sad. But when it's actually kind of more layered than that, which is why I definitely want to kind of give some insight into what depression is and kind of like different types of depression. It's not this blanket thing. Depression does come in a variety of forms, but there are criteria that designate, you know, an experience as depression as opposed to just being sad. Not to minimize being sad, but still, it's not the same as depression. That's just one element of depression. So, you know, I'll make sure that I kind of just go into that and give some information about depression too. So we can use that really as a starting point and just as a point of reference so that when you listen, you understand what we're actually talking about when we say depression, as opposed to just saying, oh, just sad, and just really give kind of that, I guess, technical background. So the information that I'm going to give now is from the National Institute of Mental Health. So, and it just gives like an overview of depression as well as like some examples. And I'll mention some of the examples too, because for me, which I'll go into more later, but for me, the specific type of depression I deal with, I didn't realize, it wasn't until later that I realized or that I learned that that's what it was. So it just was kind of insightful for me to see it defined. And I was like, oh man, that's my life. It was weird. I mean, it was affirming in a way, but it was also really weird to be like, this is what I've been experiencing for so many years of my life. And it has a term, it's been studied. Oh my God, so that was a lot for me. Okay. So for depression, the National Institute of Mental Health defines depression as a serious mood disorder. So they say either major depressive disorder or clinical depression are, kind of the terms for it. So it says it causes severe symptoms that affect how you feel, think, and handle daily activities such as sleeping, eating, or working. To be diagnosed with depression, the symptoms must be present for at least 2 weeks. And then depression is characterized by sadness and also a lack of interest in things. So there's some different types. So they have persistent depressive disorder, which is what I have. It's also called dysthymia, but it's a depressed mood that lasts for at least 2 years. A person diagnosed with persistent depressive disorder may have episodes of major depression along with periods of less severe symptoms, but symptoms must last for 2 years to be considered persistent depressive disorder. There's also like postpartum depression, and sometimes people call it the baby blues, but it's actually more serious than the quote unquote baby blues. The baby blues are like, okay, this is typical, like just had a new baby, some sadness, some anxiety, some worry, stuff like that is considered normal versus like actual postpartum depression, which is like full blown major depression during and after pregnancy. So there's like exhaustion, sadness, anxiety. It's a little bit different. And then psychotic depression is when someone has severe depression plus some form of psychosis, such as having delusions or hearing or seeing things like hallucinations. So they're depressed, but they're also having some type of like psychotic delusions. There's seasonal affective disorder, which I definitely have experienced in addition to my persistent depression. So it's like the onset of depression during the winter months when there's less natural sunlight. And a lot of people do deal with, is the acronym for it is SAD. But a lot of people do deal with seasonal affective disorder. And then, so there's bipolar disorder, which does have mania and depression. There's that. So it's so many different types of depression. But really what is classified as depression as opposed to just being sad. So there's persistent sadness, anxiousness or feeling empty, feeling hopelessness or pessimism, irritability, feelings of guilt, worthlessness or helplessness, loss of interest or pleasure in hobbies and activities, decreased energy or fatigue, moving or talking more slowly, feeling restless or having trouble sitting still, difficulty concentrating or making decisions, difficulty sleeping or either like waking up like too early or oversleeping, thoughts of death or suicide or attempts at suicide, having aches and pains, headaches, cramps, digestive issues that don't have a clear, like distinct link. And so like, say if you're having like headaches and stuff and you're having stomach issues and you seek treatment and it's not helping, that could be, a characteristic of depression too. Mm-hmm. And typically to be diagnosed with depression, you have to have, multiple symptoms that are existing. So not just 1 out of 10, but you have to be exhibiting multiple from the list. And everybody, of course, doesn't experience every symptom, but it's the combination of multiple that really are characteristic of depression. So that's just a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, I like the analogy that you said earlier about the weather versus climate. That's not actually a way I've ever thought of it before. That really resonates. I try to explain it in my own life because I have family members that aren't necessarily on board with the idea of depression as being a thing, or that they can't see it outside of sadness, because they think, if you have one good day, everything is okay. And in my case, I do suffer from the chronic persistent depression. I do go through bouts. My current bout of where it's like active depression, I understand that it's happening, has been I mean, I was going to say 3 years, but really when I think about it, it's about 5 years where this has been the case. I had a kind of a reprieve for a few months in 2015, and then it came crashing down really hard in the middle of 2015. So, and I've been riding that same wave, I guess, since then. And I'm the kind of person that is in the I go to therapy, I seek treatment, but it doesn't tend to help. It helps. It helps in the way of sort of like our podcasts are doing, in the being seen way. Even though my therapist currently is a white woman, she's the first time. I've had many a white woman therapist, but this is the first one who actually seems to have had some sensitivity training and understanding her lack of knowledge, and she's actually apologetic when she's coming at something from a different angle, so she's very aware of it, where she'll say like, I know my experience is different as a white woman, but from what I understand, and please correct me, and then she'll kind of go into her thing. So this is the first time I've dealt with a therapist that has made efforts outside of just her standard education to try to figure out how to work with and communicate and understand that the traumas that people of color experience are different than and typically different than the traumas that white people experience. So I'm very comfortable with her, and I'm happy to continue going with her. This is the first time that I haven't been actively trying to find another therapist the whole time that I'm seeing her. But So we've been seeing each other for about a year now, and we finally hit that window of where she said, now I need to try to figure out how to help you, because the techniques that normally start to break this up for people aren't connecting with me. And the problem with me specifically is that I have a lot of awareness of it, I'm not educated in it, I'm, I guess, self-educated in it, and I have a lot of awareness of my issues. And so sometimes that can be problematic when you think you know yourself so well that you're not seeing other therapies or whatever. In this case, I'm being evaluated as like, it's clear you understand what's happening with you, but we don't seem to be making progress. And I'm, it's happened to me before where I've had this question happen with a therapist where it's like, okay, we've talked it out for a year. We keep talking about it. We go over a lot of the same things. We've tried this treatment that didn't work. We tried this treatment that didn't seem to change things. We tried this. So now I need to figure out how do we continue and I help you. And that's a scary time.
That. It's getting past that awareness stage to like, okay, some type of actually some way to actually work toward resolution.
Right.
This is the thing too though, part of this, of course I say from like my lived experience, and part of it just from my, I guess you could say, career experience with my background. I mean, I'm not like a clinical psychologist, but my background is counseling. So it's part of it is just there's a difference when you think about persistent depressive disorder. And I had to learn this. So when I did a psych eval, and so the reality is I'm 30 years old. I've dealt with persistent depression, what I now know to be persistent depression, since at least 10 years old. So 20 years of persistent depression. The thing with persistent depressive disorder is the way I explain it to people is that depressed is my default. That's my baseline. Right. There's levels to it, but that's my baseline. That's different from major depression. So I've had bouts of major depression, right. But my default, my baseline is definitely the persistent depression. And so, and other things impact that. Anxiety impacts that. PTSD impacts that. The difference with that is something I've had to learn over time with just dealing with it, because I didn't know. So there would be times where I would be kind of diagnosed with other things that are still factors, but the underlying thing was what people couldn't figure out until I mean, this is only honestly recently, since I've been out here, that I actually got the persistent depressive disorder diagnosis. So, well,
that's the same for me. Like, I can think back to my childhood and can recognize things that I've now been informed about, but I wasn't diagnosed. I was in therapy as early as 12, but at no point did somebody nail it until, the last few years, but
Right.
knowing what I
And
know
because
now.
that knowledge is always growing and changing, and people have to understand the difference because major depression is, its own thing. And it's intense.
Mm-hmm.
Whew, it's intense. But persistent depressive disorder tends to be. I always said that I was like high functioning and depressed, because persistent depressive disorder tends to be more so like mild to moderate as opposed to severe, like major depression.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always operating. So the responses that people a lot of times will have to things, for me, my response may seem more like toned down, or, I just always just saw myself as like, oh, I'm more like laid back. And I am a laid back person, but a lot of that is depression. A lot of that is just like my emotional responses. And then the other thing people have to understand too about something that's characteristic of persistent depressive disorder is that it's characterized also by bouts of joy. So I can be, have that baseline of depression and I can still experience joy. And let's say I can have months where I just feel amazing. That doesn't mean that the depression is not operating. It's something that I have to contend with for the rest of my life. Yeah. Just like people who have any other kind of chronic illness or whatever, it's something that I just have to deal with. And depending on what's going on, like circumstances in your life can make it worse, or it can kind of just be at its baseline. And that's what happened to me in terms of when I say doubly depressed, when I went through major depression,
right?
Because it was a departure from my baseline. So I'm used to the baseline and I'm used to functioning with that. And I have had my bouts of joy. When I planned to propose to my wife, that was definitely a bout of joy for me, like a couple of months where I was very, very happy. I was excited. I had something to look forward to. And with depression, with it being so characterized by pessimism and hopelessness, when you have something to look forward to, it does allow you to have like these moments of happiness and joy and stuff like that. Doesn't mean the depression isn't operating. It's just there's something that counters that particular symptom in that moment, for that time frame.
Yeah. I sometimes I explain it like in my bisexual poly state, right? It's like I'm bisexual. I'm attracted to men and women, and I am poly. So, but I'm not always in a polyamorous situation. But it doesn't stop me from feeling like I identify as poly. It doesn't stop me from feeling like I identify as bisexual. Right now, I am married to a man and he is my current only partner, but that doesn't mean I stop being polyamorous or bisexual. My depression is always there. Sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm sad, and I didn't really think about it until you just said, but now I'm identifying that situation that happened where I went really dark in mid 2015 was the major about a major depression, and what I went through last summer and have been kind of still writing since the incident last summer that changed the direction of my current life. That was another bout of major depression, all the while still maintaining that baseline. So I had never had it put to me that way before, but that makes a lot of sense actually.
Right. I mean, it's really interesting to me because as I get older and I like learn more and more, and just being able to kind of look back and say, oh, this makes sense now. Because for the longest time, I didn't know, even when I started school and I started learning about mental health stuff and I knew I wanted to be a counselor, I started to an extent kind of sort of self-diagnosing, but still not having a full understanding. And as I learned more, and then I went and had like a psych eval and everything, then I had a fuller understanding of like, this is the impact this has had on my life. This is what this looked like. So I can look back at things in my life and say, oh, well, this was, I can see that, hey, I've been chronically depressed. Like, hey, that has been a baseline for me. So to the point that like it gets kind of like encompassed in your personality, I guess is the best way I can describe it. Like it becomes like this part of my personality. So me being very like something that my wife said and something that other people have said to me is that like, oh, I'm very serious. Another thing is that I'm moody. And one of the big characteristics of depression that a lot of people don't know is irritability and being moody. And so where people might think, oh, you're just like moody, or you're just a bitch or whatever, when in reality, a lot of times, and usually not, I don't want to say usually, but oftentimes in men, it presents more as irritability as opposed to sadness, but it can present in anybody. Irritability is one of the ways it can present, and anger and irritability and frustration as opposed to sadness. When people think of someone being depressed and they're like, oh, they're sad or they're crying or whatever, versus this person just being moody or being irritable, that can still be a sign of depression. And for me, irritability is a big one for me, even more so than quote unquote sadness. I don't have a lot of quote unquote like crying spells but I mean sometimes I do, but my main thing, the main way that it presents for me is definitely with the sleep issues and with irritability.
The real fuckery about depression is that it has all of the opposite symptoms available. So you're either expressing high happiness or sadness, or low happiness or sadness. You may cry, you may be overly emotional a lot of time, but you'll cry at inappropriate things, and you won't cry at the things so-called should be crying at. You'll have like abnormally high sex drive or an abnormally low sex drive. So you could like it's a fucking cluster. Like you could be any of these things. And so like for me, I tend to be a little moody. I can do definitely the irritability thing happens, but certain things trigger that versus like it being a standard. I am fairly serious in general, but I'm also super goofy, and a lot of the times when I'm talking about something very serious, I laugh. And I know it's a nervous thing. I haven't figured out how to kind of nail it down and control it all the way. I can control it in certain times, obviously. But like I will say some really terrible things that have happened to me, and I will be laughing while I talk about it. Whether it's the child abuse that I suffered as a kid with my father, or the rape when I was 12 and rape when I was 21. Like I'll talk about these things and I'm laughing while I do it, and I understand and I've been told several times about what it is with me, and something that I kind of focus on in my sort of self-education about what my deal is that I clearly have an overactive hypothalamus. Like that center, that bridge, that sort of where all your emotions and your sort of reactions to things are sort of centered in your brain. Mine is going all the time. So I can be sitting here like having an insane, very difficult conversation about my marriage with my husband and be just flat, no emotion. And then one thing that he may say can trigger like the floodgates. Or I can sit there and watch, something really terrible on TV, like a child abuse or something crazy like that. And I won't, I'll feel moved to emotion, but I won't cry from it. But then I'll see like a person smile at someone from across the room in a thing, and that'll make me cry. Like, so this weird thing that we're suffering will make you do things that don't seem to match what you're dealing with.
The situation. Right. I mean, because part of it is characteristic of depression, and part of it is just from being, because the difference, like that's why I think it's important for people to understand that there are different types of depression. Some things are specific to persistent depressive disorder. Like when you are chronically depressed, like when depression, I just describe it saying depression is a baseline. When it's a baseline, that impacts how you respond to things. That impacts how it's a brain thing. It impacts your brain chemistry. So the way that you respond to things may not always seem quote unquote normal or neurotypical, because they're not. Because literally your brain chemistry is different. It has been impacted by depression. So I can, and then too, and those things change over time. So like, I'm not much of a crier per se. I will say probably over the past few years, I maybe cried more than I used to in the past, but in general, I'm not much of a crier, even when it's very much warranted. But that's because of my brain chemistry, with like it being impacted for so many years with depression, and depression, part of that being like your emotional responses being lowered. You just kind of have more of this flat mood or this flat response, even though you can be feeling all these things, but it's like the expression of your mood has, is flat or whatever. And that's become a part of like your brain chemistry. That's really what it is. So it's like, sometimes it's like, not like, oh, I'm not sad. That's just crying. It's just not necessarily the response I have, versus other times, instead of a situation where like, say you may be angry, I might cry or something like that. So it really just depends. That's part of it. And then so part of it just has to do with brain chemistry. A big part of it has to do with brain chemistry. And then the other component of it is nurture. So we look at nature versus nurture. Nature is the brain chemistry. Like, I have no control over that. I ain't nothing I can do about that. But the nurture is how we are, trained and indoctrinated and ingrained, like, to respond to things. So I already have the brain chemistry stuff going on. Plus, I'm a Black woman. You're supposed to be, we have a very limited scope, a very limited like amount of guidelines or whatever for how strong it's supposed to look. Because you can be emotional is not the antithesis to strength. So you can be emotional and be strong, but for us, for Black women, that is not the case. Like, you can't be both. We have this very one-dimensional definition of like what strength looks like for us. Other people can still, like cry or still do whatever and still be strong, but we can't do that. Right. So is that too operating? It's the cultural thing and it's the systemic thing operating too, that like, I have to be strong, I have to be this. So when you have the brain chemistry, you have the nature plus the nurture, then I'm looked at like, I've been told, oh, you're so nonchalant. Oh, you're so whatever. And I'm like, I actually am a sensitive person. I am deeply emotional. I don't wear it on my sleeve at all. I can be, even when I have anxiety, and even when I have anxiety attacks, I don't externally, a lot of times you won't know externally. It's an internal freak out, but externally I'm stoic. And it comes out in other little ways, but we'll get into that on another thing.
I would say that that's probably similar to me too. I will have my physical obvious freakouts on occasion, more so now. I feel like I can't tell if my defenses are a little bit lower now than they were before because of just the chronicness of this, or if it's because I am actively trying to destigmatize depression and be open about it, that I'm also trying to allow that to show more. I can't tell which one it is, or if it's a combination of the two or something else. But I do find, like, culturally I was trained not to be emotional in front of people, and that usually I have to be involved with this person for a very long time for my emotions to be obvious to them. And now I'm finding that it's starting to slip out in different ways, and I still do those defense things where I'm trying to avoid it. I think one time I even said to you, is like, I need to text this to you versus talk to you, because if I say it to you, I'm going to start crying. And it was like me trying not to, not to show you that weakness of crying, that perceived weakness, and I'm still out here trying to fight against that and say, sometimes you have to be able to show that, and it's okay. But I fight that nurture version of it, which is told me both on the Japanese side, well, actually all three, on the Black side, the Japanese side, and the British side. This is weakness. Don't do this. So it's tough to make that balance. I mean,
vulnerability is not an easy thing, and being expressive is not an easy thing, especially when you're told that you should not do that. And you're told that you should not. You're told that you should not do it. For one, because you have to be strong, and it's not strong. And the other thing is because no one cares. So it's like, when people say like, oh, suck it up, you need to, no one is going to care about. And it's a very pervasive thing where people are like, let's say with children. And this is something that actually this couple that I watch on YouTube, I love that they said this. But one of the things is that a lot of times we stifle kids' emotions, and then that ends up carrying over into adulthood. If something happens and we're like, don't cry, or don't, don't suck it up, and you got to toughen up and all this kind of stuff. But this couple, what they said was, they're like, they essentially said, we don't police our son's emotional responses. So they're like, if something happens and he says, I'm sad, and we don't say, oh, don't be sad. We ask him, why are you sad? Right. And then he'll tell us, and we'll say, it's okay to be sad. Or if he's like, I'm angry, and we're like, why are you angry? It's okay to be angry. So they validate his emotions, and he's little.
God, that'd be amazing.
I don't know how old he is. I want to say like 2 maybe, or something like that. I don't feel like he's over 3. I think he's maybe 2 or 3. And this couple, they're called the Johnsons. It's like Mrs. and Mrs. Johnson. They're on YouTube, so I'm gonna plug them because I love watching them. This lesbian couple. But with their son, I just think and it was so simple, but I just love how matter of factly they were just like, we don't, they don't like spank him or anything like that. And the biggest thing that just resonated with me was them saying they don't try to, they don't punish him for his emotions. I think that's how they described it. Like, they don't punish him for his emotions. They ask him how he feels, and he tells them. And so they said, because they're like, he's a sensitive child, he's an emotional child, and there's nothing wrong with that. But because of that, he comes to them and tells them how he feels, and he's little, but he's like this little brilliant, little boy, and he'll come to them and just be like, I feel sad, or I feel mad, or I feel whatever, because they've they've created an environment that nurtures that, where they're like, okay, they're not blowing up on him for saying he's angry, or, they're not yelling at him and all this kind of stuff. Like, they'll say something, if he's wrong, he's wrong. And they'll say, okay, don't do that. That's not nice or something, but they don't police his emotions. And I think that is so amazing. And it's simple, but it's like, we have been policed so much, and we are, our emotions are policed systemically as well as interpersonally, that is like this revolutionary thing that they're just like, we don't police our child's emotions. And with the kids that I work with now, because right now I'm working with a client who works at a daycare, I do the same thing. So if I see a child that looks sad, I'm like, what's wrong? And they'll say, they'll say whatever it is. And I'm like, okay, that's okay. So a little girl, she was like, she's like, I'm sad. I said, why are you sad? And it was something about a toy or something. I'm like, it's okay to be sad. So I was like, you won't feel sad forever. And, so just give yourself some time. I said, you want to sit down? And so she sat down. I was like, okay. And I was like, you can go back and play when you don't feel sad anymore. So that kind of thing. I mean, you don't have to, it's just not policing. So when they said that just gave me all my life.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, it is a big part of our culture too, like the for masculinity, that any kind of sad or even happy emotion is almost not allowed to be exhibited.
They're like, man up.
Yeah, and man up, sack up. We talk about having balls to be as a form of strength.
But if you're quote unquote soft and you're a pussy, and don't even get me started on that, because we don't want to.
I got a whole thing about balls and pussy, because balls are soft and they fall apart if they get hit, and pussies pass children, and that's super painful. So we should be saying this thing backwards.
Exactly. But yeah, but that's what I was going to say. I'm just like, yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. This is actually part one of a two-part episode that is a collaboration between Black Radical Queer and Militantly Mixed. So every now and then, Sharmane and I will get together to do these segments that we call Mind On My Melanin, that will focus on mental health issues from the perspective of people of color. So we definitely will have more, and we hope that you enjoy them. Make sure you tune in, and when you see Mind On My Melanin, then you'll know that that's what that means. Make sure that you tune in to Militantly Mixed. The episode drops Thursday at midnight, so that way you can hear part 2. Thank you so much for listening, and that's it. Black Radical Queer is a ManeHustle Media podcast hosted by Jhavia Nicole and produced and edited by Sharmane Johnson. Music is by Young Carts. You can find us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Black Rad Queer. That's BLKRADQWR. And you can also listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to stay connected to us in our discussion group. It's called the BRQ Discussion Group on Facebook, where we will continue the conversations that we start in the podcast.
ManeHustle Media. Turn your side hustle into your main hustle.